When it comes to the modern NBA, there is no doubt the players are extremely skilled as well as talented. And I think some fans would argue the NBA right now has more talent than it's ever seen. And don't get me wrong, these players are definitely very skilled, very dedicated, and they're great players. But looking at past eras, the quote-unquote old school eras, I think that era in NBA basketball was still better than this current era in 2023. So looking at reason number one of why old school basketball was better, it's just pretty simple. The defensive rules, the defensive play was much better. As in 2023, on any given night, you can see a guy score 50, 60, and definitely 40 points. That's really common today. When back in the late 90s, early 2000s, a guy scoring 50 points, even 40, that was a big deal and front page news. But due to a lot of the rule changes, the referee calling, now in 2023, offensive scoring is just so watered down. As looking at the entire NBA last season, there were 25 games where a player scored 50 plus points. That is the most in over 50 years since Wilt Chamberlain played in the early 1960s. And if you take Wilt Chamberlain out of the record books, say he doesn't exist, for the past 5 years in the NBA, we had the most 50-point games in a season. And for comparison, back in 2004, there were only 5 games where a player scored 50 points. In 1997, it was even lower with 3 games where a player scored 50 plus. So I ask you guys, how in a 25-year time period do we go from 3 50-point games all the way now to 25? It's pretty simple. The defensive rules are simply garbage, and the players today, their effort on defense, it's hit or miss night to night. And unfortunately for fans nowadays, when a guy scores 50, it's not nearly as special as it was just 10 years ago. And I think the overall high-scoring games, big-time scoring matchups, it dilutes the product and overall value of cracking 50 or 60 points. And for that comparison, why I chose 04-97, I think that time period, that 7-8 year gap, that was the best defensive era of all time. As during those years, teams rarely cracked 100 points. They were in the mid-90s, upper 90s at the most. But right in that sweet spot of 94-95 points, not 120 like in today's NBA. And looking at the best players in that 8-year period, once again, 97 to 04. In that era, there were only 3 players who averaged 30 points in a single season. That being Iverson, McGrady, as well as Kobe. To show you how diluted scoring is nowadays, in 2023, we've had 6 players just last year who cracked 30. That being Giannis, Luka, SGA, Dame Lillard, as well as Tatum. And by 6 players averaging 30 points, that ties the record for most players ever in a single season. And looking at players who averaged 25 points, in each of the past 4 years, that record has been broken nearly every year. As in 2020, we had 14 players, 21-17, 22-14 again, and this year, a whopping 20 players averaging 25 points. My point being, while there are great players, talented offensive players, the scoring numbers obviously are definitely inflated and boosted like the 1960s. And looking at overall teams, the scoring nowadays is still ridiculous, even for team standards. As last year, 29 of 30 teams averaged at least 110 points per game, and 14 of 30 cracked 115 on average. For comparison, back in 97, the 2 best offensive teams averaged 103.1 points, that being the Bulls as well as the Jazz. And looking at 04, the Dallas Mavericks that year averaged 105.2 points per game. The best scoring offenses, the Jazz, Bulls, Mavericks, the Tim Duncan Spurs, Kobe Shaq Lakers, they would rank dead last in scoring in this era. And those players, those teams, they weren't bad offensive teams by any means. It's just their era was much more defensive and much more balanced in terms of rules as well as play style. And the sad reality we have to face, these gaudy stats, big time numbers, they're not slowing down anytime soon. And truly great defensive eras like the 90s and 2000s, unfortunately, it's not coming back. Now, the second reason old school basketball was better is the players back then actually valued playing games, and some guys actually tried to play all 82 games. In this load management era, sitting out games, resting, it's gotten completely out of hand. And nowadays players, for the most part, don't take pride in playing all 82 games, they rest back-to-backs, and it's very commonplace to rest that third game in 4 nights. You can clown the 1990s, call them plumbers, but it is pretty embarrassing. Someone like John Stockton, a short little white dude wearing nursing shoes, he suited up virtually every game he could and never sat out. As his first 5 years in the NBA, he played all 82 games, and from 85-97, missed a grand total of 4 games. And even more impressive than that, from age 36 to 40, John Stockton didn't miss a single game at that advanced age. Miss me with the old guys need rest narrative. If John Stockton can do it, trust me, you can do it too. And looking at players who play all 82 games, this year in the NBA, there were 10 guys who accomplished that. That is the second lowest all time, behind 2022, where only 5 guys did it. And a stat that really blow your mind, in 1990 and 2000, there was a whopping 58 players who played all 82 games. And for the 90s, playing all the games, that was commonplace for around 50 players every single season. And look, I do understand it, playing every game, it's a very, very tall task. But players nowadays, pulling the Ben Simmons, the Zion, the Kawhi load management stuff, it's a bridge too far from actually resting and needing rest. And it might sound harsh, but sitting out when healthy, it's very disgraceful to the game as well as the fans. And the problem of load management is so pervasive, even current day NBA stars are making it clear. They try to play every game, try their best, and play all 82 if possible. And look, I'll give Tatum credit for saying this, but 20 years ago, you didn't have to say this publicly or tell fans this. It was a mindset of the players and something they knew inherently they had to do, or at least try to do. Maybe Tatum saying this will flip that switch in players. I doubt it. Because unfortunately today's players, they don't take pride in playing all 82 games and showing up every single night. Now, the last reason why old school basketball was flat out better, as well as more entertaining, is back then you had actual rivalries as well as competitiveness. As now in the 2020s, nothing makes me throw up more than seeing 2 so-called rivals being buddy-buddy, laughing, hamming it up in a pivotal playoff game or a primetime matchup. And look, some guys, yes, they are friends. You can be friends off the court. Everyone gets that. But between those lines, it should be cutthroat if you're trying to beat that guy at all costs. And the so-called tough guy of this era, Draymond Green, he's basically a fanboy of the best player of this era. As when it comes to LeBron James, he's like a 12-year-old schoolgirl just drooling the sidelines. Imagine Scottie Pippen back in the 90s playing with Michael Jordan, just gushing about Clyde Drexler. It wouldn't happen. Or Kobe in 04, just in awe of Kevin Garnett and just, oh my gosh, Kevin Garnett, he's so great, he's the best, while playing alongside Shaq. That is what Draymond does to LeBron James while playing with Steph. And when it comes to rivalries, what do you say is the biggest rivalry, most iconic rivalry in the NBA today? I'm not talking about teams that play once or twice a year, met once in the playoffs. I'm talking about actual rivalries and extended series. It's hard to think of a really good one. The best we really have is Steph versus LeBron, but that's kind of two players. It's not Warriors versus Lakers, and it's not Warriors versus Cavs anymore. You don't have Bulls versus Pistons, Lakers versus Celtics, Knicks versus Heat, Philly versus Boston. You don't have those iconic matchups like in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And I think for this era, what it's desperately missing is a rivalry like that to carry the league, as well as its popularity. So that right there is the end of the video, and why old school basketball is definitively better than the new school basketball. As always, thank you guys for watching, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.